The parish hall of Flaxborough was seldom the scene of anything more dramatic than lukewarm tea or gentle disputes over raffle tickets. On this particular Tuesday evening, however, it possessed a rare air of industry, for the St. Swithin's Choral Society had assembled for its weekly rehearsal. Mrs. Daphne Weatherby, who had been directing the choir for 12 years with a firmness that bordered occasionally on mild despotism, stood before the assembled singers, tapping a tuning fork against the music stand. She was a slender woman, whose authority seemed to derive not from volume, but from an almost spiritual disappointment in those who sang flat. "Altos, please remember that we are not lamenting the fall of Jerusalem," she said crisply. "We are singing Mendelssohn." The altos, a cluster of respectable ladies who regarded the distinction as somewhat theoretical, adjusted their sheet music with renewed caution. Behind them, the tenors shifted uneasily. Mr. Lionel Pritchard, a solicitor of agreeable manner and moderate vocal confidence, cleared his throat with a sound resembling the preliminary stages of a motor car attempting to start. The rehearsal proceeded with its usual pattern of polite correction and intermittent musical success. Outside the tall windows, the market square had already fallen quiet. A thin mist had begun to creep across the cobbles, giving the lamps a faintly haloed glow. Flaxborough, at such moments, resembled the sort of town where nothing improper had occurred since the invention of the teapot. This appearance, it must be said, was often misleading. The basses were engaged in a somewhat determined interpretation of a passage involving the word glory, when Mr. Cedric Toller, who sang bass primarily because his voice refused to cooperate with any other category, raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Toller," said Mrs. Weatherby, with the patient dignity of someone accustomed to interruptions of a minor sort. "I wonder," he said thoughtfully, "whether someone might have left the vestry door open." Several singers glanced over their shoulders. The vestry door stood at the far end of the hall, partially concealed behind a folding screen that had once been intended to hide coats, but now chiefly concealed unused hymn books. From behind the screen there seemed to be a faint sound. It was not a particularly alarming sound. Indeed, one might describe it as the sort of noise produced when a moderately heavy object adjusted its position on a wooden floor. Mrs. Weatherby frowned. "Mr. Toller, if the door is open, kindly close it." Mr. Toller, whose curiosity had already outpaced his sense of musical duty, rose obligingly and crossed the hall. He pushed aside the screen. There was a pause. Then Mr. Toller said, with admirable restraint, "Good heavens!" The choir turned. Mrs. Weatherby lowered her baton. "What is it?" she asked. Mr. Toller did not immediately reply. He remained standing quite still, gazing into the vestry with the expression of a man who has encountered something that does not readily correspond with his expectations of a Tuesday evening. Mrs. Weatherby walked briskly down the hall. When she reached the vestry doorway, she looked inside. Her baton slipped from her fingers and rolled gently across the floor. Inside the vestry, Mr. Bernard Quince lay on the carpet beside the harmonium. Mr. Quince was the society's treasurer. He was also at that moment very distinctly dead. The discovery produced, as might be expected, a number of reactions. Mrs. Weatherby uttered a brief but remarkably controlled gasp. Mr. Pritchard removed his spectacles and polished them with deliberate care, as if clarity of vision might somehow rearrange the circumstances. Miss Ivy Cartwright, the soprano with the most reliable high notes in the parish, murmured, "Oh dear." There followed a silence which lasted nearly 20 seconds. It was broken, curiously enough, by Mr. Toller. "I believe," he said in a reflective tone, "that he's been struck on the head." The observation was difficult to dispute. Mr. Quince's head rested at an angle which suggested that gravity had played an unwelcome role in recent events. Beside him, the brass collection box used for choir subscriptions lay overturned. A small hammer ordinarily employed to adjust the harmonium pedals rested a short distance away. Mrs. Weatherby drew herself upright. "Mr. Pritchard," she said firmly, "you had better telephone the police." Mr. Pritchard nodded with the grave composure of a man who had always suspected that amateur music might eventually lead to complications. The call reached Flaxborough Police Station at 8:43 p.m. Inspector Purbright received the message while engaged in the quiet administrative activity of reviewing a file concerning improperly parked delivery vans. He listened to the report with a thoughtful expression. "Dead in the vestry, you say?" he murmured. Sergeant Love, who had been examining a paperclip with philosophical interest, looked up. "Yes, sir." Purbright replaced the receiver. "It appears," he said mildly, "that the Choral Society has encountered a difficulty." Love waited. "Mr. Bernard Quince," Purbright continued, "has been found deceased during choir practice." Love frowned. "Murder, sir?" Purbright reached for his hat. "That," he said gently, "is precisely the question." 10 minutes later, the police car rolled into the misty square outside St. Swithin's Parish Hall. Inside the hall, the choir members had gathered in small clusters. Their conversations possessed the subdued intensity of people attempting to behave sensibly while contemplating the possibility that something quite improper had occurred among them. Mrs. Weatherby greeted the inspector with visible relief. Inspector Purbright was a tall man whose manner suggested patient curiosity rather than authority. His voice carried the calm politeness of someone who preferred listening to speaking. "Good evening," he said pleasantly. Mrs. Weatherby gestured toward the vestry. "I'm afraid it's most distressing." Purbright stepped inside. He regarded the scene with quiet interest. Mr. Quince lay where he had fallen. The harmonium hammer remained on the floor. Purbright crouched beside the body. Sergeant Love leaned in the doorway. "What do you think, sir?" Purbright examined the overturned collection box. Coins had spilled across the carpet. He lifted one thoughtfully. "Choir subscriptions?" he asked. Mrs. Weatherby nodded. "Yes, Mr. Quince always collected them before rehearsal." Purbright rose slowly. "Tell me," he said, glancing toward the assembled singers, "did anyone notice Mr. Quince leaving the hall?" There were murmurs. Mr. Pritchard cleared his throat. "He stepped out shortly before we began the second hymn." "Alone? Yes, I believe so." Purbright nodded. He looked again at the hammer. A small object beside it caught his attention. He bent and picked it up. It was a cufflink, silver, engraved with a tiny treble clef. Purbright turned it thoughtfully in his fingers. Then he slipped it into his pocket. Outside the vestry, the choir members waited with increasing unease. Flaxborough had not seen a murder in several years, and certainly not one connected with Mendelssohn. Inspector Purbright stepped back into the hall. His expression remained politely neutral. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "I'm afraid we shall need to ask you all a few questions." Across the room, someone whispered to Miss Cartwright, "I always said something odd about Mr. Quince." Miss Cartwright nodded gravely. In Flaxborough, gossip had already begun its work, and Inspector Purbright, though he did not show it, had begun to listen. Inspector Purbright's request was received with the sort of collective resignation that attends bad weather at a bank holiday. No one objected aloud, though several faces took on the expression of people who felt that a quiet Tuesday had been made to answer for far more than it ought. Mrs. Weatherby was the first to recover enough dignity to be useful. She arranged chairs in a row against the wall and requested, in a tone still accustomed to obedience, that nobody should wander off in search of coats or bicycles until the inspector had finished. The choir complied. Flaxborough people, whatever else might be said of them, had a deep instinct for remaining near remarkable events while pretending to dislike them. Sergeant Love took names in his careful, upright hand. Mr. Cedric Toller gave his with a certain solemnity, as though he had unexpectedly entered history. Miss Ivy Cartwright spoke in a lowered voice more suited to bedside vigils than parish administration. Mr. Lionel Pritchard, solicitor and tenor, supplied not only his own particulars, but those of 2 absent choristers, and the probable whereabouts of the church warden. He had the helpfulness of a man to whom calamity presented itself chiefly as a clerical challenge. Purbright moved among them without haste, speaking quietly, and pausing often enough to let silence do its work. People in distress, he knew, either rushed to fill a silence or began to fear what they had omitted from it. Both tendencies could be useful. "Mr. Quince was here before the rest of you?" he asked. Mrs. Weatherby folded her hands tightly. "He usually was. He liked to lay out the subscription book and complain privately about arrears." "Did he have enemies?" She gave a brief, disapproving breath. "In the dramatic sense, no. In the ordinary parish sense, quite a few. That, in Flaxborough, narrowed nothing. Bernard Quince had been a shopkeeper of the old sort, exact in money matters and unembarrassed by reminding others of them. Since retiring from his ironmongery business, he had devoted himself to committees, subcommittees, and the correction of minor financial laxities. He was a widower, childless, punctual, and not greatly loved. His usefulness had long exceeded his charm. "Who handled the subscription box besides Mr. Quince?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Weatherby considered. "No one, regularly. Though if he stepped away, he might leave it with Miss Cartwright or with Mr. Pritchard." Miss Cartwright, hearing her name, looked over with the air of a person being drawn into a conversation she had hoped to survive merely by looking stricken. "Only once or twice," she said. "I never counted anything." "I should be very surprised if you had," said Purbright pleasantly. A faint murmur of uneasy approval moved through the room. Even at moments of shock, Flaxborough appreciated moderation. Outside, word had already reached the square. It travelled first through a boy sent to fetch the doctor, then through the chemist's assistant, who told it to his sister on the understanding that it was not to go further, and from her to Mrs. Murch at the newsagent's, who regarded discretion as a form of temporary storage. By 9:30, 3 separate versions of the event had reached the Crown and Mitre, each improving slightly on the last. In one, Quince had been discovered with the church silver in his arms. In another, he had surprised burglars. In the most popular account, he had been struck down over a matter connected with the soprano line, though what moral irregularity the soprano line could conceal remained delightfully uncertain. At the hall, Dr. Fanshawe arrived, peered into the vestry with weary competence, and confirmed what everyone had assumed and nobody had wanted confirmed. Death had been recent and, in his view, violent. "Blow to the skull," he said quietly to Purbright. "Likely that hammer, though I dare say you'll have that settled properly." Purbright thanked him and glanced again toward the little knot of choristers. Their voices had lowered now into the confidential register in which English people discuss either illness or upholstery. "Did anyone hear an argument?" he asked, generally. There was a pause, then Mr. Toller said, "I heard something like a door closing when, during the second hymn, or just before. It's difficult to be exact when one is singing about glory." "Naturally." Mr. Pritchard adjusted his spectacles. "I thought I heard someone speaking in the corridor, but I took it for Mr. Quince muttering over the accounts. Was he known to mutter?" "Frequently," said Mrs. Weatherby. Purbright accepted this as established fact. He drew Sergeant Love a little aside. We shall want the list of members, committee officers, and anyone with access to the vestry, he said. Also, tomorrow morning, a word with the vicar and the church warden. Love nodded. Do you think robbery's in it, sir? Purbright's eyes moved to the spilled coins, the hammer, the embarrassed faces, and the small social machinery already straining to produce a respectable explanation. Possibly, he said, though one dislikes a robbery that pauses to attend choir practice. As the first statements were taken, the town went on quietly rearranging the facts to suit itself. By midnight, Flaxborough would have decided not only who had killed Bernard, Quince, but why and in what regrettable tone of voice. Purbright, who had seen this before, made no effort to prevent it. Gossip, while seldom truthful in detail, had a useful instinct for circling the sore place. Before leaving the vestry, he let his hand rest briefly on the doorframe and looked once more at the carpet, the collection box, and the place where Quince had fallen. Then he glanced down at the silver cufflink in his pocket and wondered, not for the first time, why men who wished to pass unnoticed so often contrived to leave behind a signature. Inspector Purbright remained in the parish hall somewhat longer than the choir expected. While Sergeant Love concluded the final notes of his list, Purbright moved quietly among the chairs with the air of a man arranging thoughts rather than furniture. Outside the vestry, the choristers had settled into a subdued patience, which combined discomfort with curiosity. He began, as he often preferred, with the person least likely to conceal her feelings. Miss Ivy Cartwright sat near the window, her sheet music folded neatly upon her lap, though there seemed little prospect of further singing that evening. She looked up as Purbright approached, her expression a mixture of solemnity and faint anticipation. "Miss Cartwright," he said kindly, "I understand you sing soprano." "Yes, Inspector, a demanding line." She allowed herself the smallest smile. "Mrs. Weatherby believes so. I imagine Mr. Quince held the subscription box this evening as usual?" "Yes." "He collected them before rehearsal began." "I gave him mine just after arriving." "Did you notice anything unusual about him?" Miss Cartwright reflected with careful seriousness. "Well, he seemed rather distracted. He checked the book twice and said something about people falling behind again." "I assumed he meant the subscriptions." Purbright nodded. Bernard Quince's concern with falling behind had apparently been extensive. Did he speak with anyone in particular? She hesitated briefly. Mr. Toller, perhaps? They were discussing the accounts for the harvest concert. An animated discussion? Oh no, Mr. Quince rarely animated himself. Purbright thanked her and moved on. Mr. Cedric Toller received the inspector with a gravity suggesting that bass singers considered themselves naturally responsible witnesses. "I suppose," Toller began, "that finding him like that makes me the principal discoverer." "In a manner of speaking," said Purbright. Toller explained that Quince had indeed raised concerns about the choir funds. According to him, the treasurer had lately taken to checking the subscription ledger with what Toller described as a slightly prosecutorial air. "Did he accuse anyone directly?" Purbright asked. "Not precisely, though he hinted that certain members were developing creative interpretations of the word paid." "Do you know whom he meant?" Toller glanced discreetly across the hall. "Well, Mr. Pritchard had been late once or twice." Purbright's eyebrows rose mildly. "A solicitor in arrears? Only temporarily, I'm sure." Purbright thanked him and crossed to where Lionel Pritchard stood near the coat rack, adjusting his cuff with thoughtful precision. The solicitor greeted the inspector with composed courtesy. "A regrettable business, Inspector." "Quite." Purbright allowed a small pause. "I understand Mr. Quince had spoken about subscriptions this evening." Pritchard gave a small sigh. "Yes, he had become rather zealous about them." I told him it was hardly a matter for alarm. Did he agree? Not entirely. Did your conversation continue into the corridor? Pritchard hesitated only briefly. I stepped out for a moment before the second hymn. I wished to fetch a pencil from my coat. Did you see Mr. Quince then? No, I assumed he had gone into the vestry. Purbright inclined his head. And you heard nothing unusual? Nothing beyond the choir itself, which, Purbright reflected privately, might conceal almost any sound. Across the hall, Mrs. Weatherby was speaking with Sergeant Love. Her voice carried a careful firmness, as if determined that parish dignity should not entirely collapse under homicide. Purbright joined them. Mrs. Weatherby, how long had Mr. Quince been treasurer? 12 years. A position requiring trust. Indeed, though he often behaved as if he were the only trustworthy person involved. Purbright smiled faintly. Did he keep the choir accounts here? No, he kept them at home. But he always brought the subscription book. And the collection box? Yes. Purbright glanced toward the vestry door. Was the vestry usually left open during rehearsal? Normally closed. Then someone opened it tonight. Mrs. Weatherby's lips pressed together thoughtfully. That would seem likely. Sergeant Love finished his notes and stepped forward. We got the list, sir. Purbright accepted the sheet but did not immediately read it. Instead, he looked once more across the quiet hall. The choir members now spoke in low, speculative tones. Already their voices had acquired the cautious excitement of people rehearsing theories. In Flaxborough, speculation matured quickly. Purbright walked slowly back toward the vestry entrance. The carpet inside had been marked with chalk where the body had lain. The hammer remained on a small evidence cloth near the harmonium. He crouched again beside the overturned collection box. Coins glimmered faintly beneath the electric light. Curious, he murmured. Sergeant Love leaned closer. What is, sir? Purbright lifted the box carefully. Choir subscriptions, he said, but not enough for a full evening. You think some are missing? Perhaps. Or perhaps Mr. Quince had not finished collecting. Love frowned thoughtfully. And the cufflink? Purbright slipped a hand into his pocket, turning the small silver treble clef between his fingers. Yes, he said softly. The cufflink. He rose slowly and looked toward the assembled singers. In a town the size of Flaxborough, possessions travelled in small circles. Objects were noticed, remembered, and occasionally discussed with surprising accuracy. A cufflink, particularly one shaped like a musical cymbal, would not go unnoticed for long. Purbright's eyes rested briefly on Lionel Pritchard's cuffs, then on Cedric Toller's sleeves, then on the empty doorway leading to the corridor, where someone had once closed a door during the singing of glory. At length he turned back to Sergeant Love. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "we shall speak with Mr. Quince's neighbours." Love nodded. "And the choir?" Purbright regarded the hall once more. "Oh yes," he said gently, "I think the choir will continue to be very helpful." By the following morning, Flaxborough had, with admirable efficiency, reached a provisional conclusion regarding the death of Bernard Quince. It had been robbery. This view possessed several advantages. It was simple, it involved outsiders, and it required no uncomfortable reflections upon the conduct of respectable townspeople who sang Mendelssohn on Tuesday evenings. Inspector Purbright, arriving at the station shortly after 9, discovered Sergeant Love studying the morning newspaper with an expression that suggested mild scepticism. "They've got it already, sir," Love said. Purbright hung his hat on the rack. Indeed, Love tapped the column. "Treasurer slain during church robbery." That's what the Gazette's calling it. Purbright considered this briefly. Very prompt. They say the collection box was disturbed. That part appears accurate. Love folded the paper. Most of the town seems to think it must have been some fellow wandering in from the road. Purbright poured himself a modest cup of tea. One admires the town's generosity, he said mildly, to assume a stranger would travel here specifically to rob a choir. Love grinned faintly. Well, sir, it saves people asking awkward questions. Purbright did not disagree. He picked up the list of choir members and turned it over slowly in his hands. The names had a reassuring familiarity. Cartwright, Toller, Pritchard, Hemsley, Dobson, Clark. Flaxborough people tended to remain in one place long enough to develop reputations as durable as their furniture. "Let us begin," Purbright said, "with Mr. Quince himself." Bernard Quince's house stood 3 streets from the market square, a narrow brick property whose windows suggested order and careful dusting. The inspector and Love were admitted by Mrs. Dalrymple, Quince's neighbour, who had been performing the useful task of supervising the premises since the news had spread. "He was a very precise gentleman," she said as they entered the sitting-room, "always closing his gate exactly, and very particular about money." "Did he receive many visitors?" Purbright asked. "Not really, though lately he seemed a little troubled." "In what way?" "Well, I heard him speaking rather sharply on the telephone last week. Something about accounts." Purbright glanced toward the small desk by the window. On it lay a ledger book and several neatly arranged envelopes. Love lifted the ledger. "Choir subscription, sir." Purbright opened it carefully. The columns were exact and orderly, but a number of entries bore small penciled marks beside them. "What do you make of those?" Love asked. "Possibly reminders," Purbright said, "or suspicions." He studied one entry more closely. Lionel Pritchard, a small cross had been drawn beside the name. "Interesting," Purbright murmured. They continued their quiet search of the room. Quince's habits had clearly favoured meticulousness over charm. Bills were stacked with geometric precision. Letters were tied with string. Love opened a drawer. "Sir?" Inside lay a folded sheet of paper. Purbright unfolded it. It was a list, not of choir members, but of amounts. Some sums were neatly circled. Others had question marks beside them. "What sort of list is that?" Love asked. "Possibly," Purbright said thoughtfully. "A list of concerns." At the bottom of the page, one figure had been underlined twice. £3, 10 shillings. Beside it was a note in Quince's tight handwriting. "Ask P." Love raised his eyebrows. "Pritchard?" "Possibly." Love rubbed his chin. "That makes him look rather awkward, sir." "Yes." Purbright folded the paper again, but awkwardness and guilt are not quite the same thing. They returned to the street a few minutes later. The town had already begun its usual morning routine. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps. Bicycles rattled past the square. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, something had shifted. At the Crown and Mitre, 2 men were discussing the matter with confident authority. "I told you," one of them was saying. "It'll turn out to be some travelling thief." Purbright paused long enough to hear the rest. "They come through towns like ours," the man continued. "See a church, think there's silver about." His companion nodded sagely, probably panicked when Quince walked in. Purbright walked on. Love glanced sideways. "Neat explanation. Very neat. You don't believe it?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Robbers rarely leave cufflinks behind," he said. They reached the police car. Love looked thoughtful. "So you think it's someone local?" Purbright did not answer immediately. Across the square, Lionel Pritchard was emerging from his office, adjusting his coat cuffs with the composed air of a man preparing for an ordinary day. Purbright's eyes rested briefly on the solicitor's sleeves. Then he looked away again. "Let us say," he said gently, that the truth will almost certainly prove less convenient than the town hopes. The car door closed quietly. Behind them, Flaxborough continued its careful discussion of robbery, strangers, and the reassuring improbability that the matter might involve anyone who sang in its choir. The morning in Flaxborough continued with the reassuring steadiness of a town that preferred its irregularities to remain temporary. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love drove slowly along Market Lane, the police car moving with the same measured caution that characterized most civic matters in the town. Purbright appeared to be watching the shop fronts with mild interest. In reality, he was thinking about Bernard Quince. "Methodical man," Love said after a moment. "Yes." Love glanced at him. Men like that don't usually get themselves killed over a handful of choir coins. Purbright did not immediately respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver cufflink with the treble clef engraving. "Nor," he said quietly, "do burglars usually arrive wearing musical jewelry." Love studied it again. "Anyone in the choir wear things like that? Possibly." They parked outside a narrow tailor's shop that had served Flaxborough for 3 generations. The window displayed several respectable suits and a rather ambitious waistcoat. "Why here, sir?" Love asked. Purbright stepped out of the car. "In towns of this size," he said, "tailors often possess an admirable memory for their customers' cuffs." Inside the shop, Mr. Harold Denton greeted them with cautious politeness. "Inspector?" Purbright placed the cufflink on the counter. "Have you seen its owner recently?" Denton adjusted his spectacles and examined it carefully. "Well now, yes, I believe I have." "Who?" "Mr. Lionel Pritchard." Love gave Purbright a quick glance. Denton continued thoughtfully. "Pair of them, of course. He had the shirts altered last month. I remember because he said they were a gift from the choir after the Christmas concert." "Did he mention losing one?" Purbright asked. "No." Purbright thanked him and stepped outside again. Love let out a quiet breath. "That puts Pritchard right in the middle of things." "Perhaps." "You found the cufflink in the vestry?" "Yes." "And Quince had questions about his accounts?" Purbright nodded mildly. "It certainly forms a pattern." Love folded his arms. "Pretty neat one, too." Purbright regarded the quiet street. "Yes," he said. "That is precisely why it troubles me." Love frowned. "Troubles you? A pattern that fits too comfortably often belongs to someone who arranged it." Love considered that for a moment. "You think someone planted the cufflink?" "I think it is possible." They returned to the car, but Purbright did not immediately start the engine. Instead, he turned the cufflink again in the light. Something about it continued to bother him. Not the object itself, something smaller, something almost trivial. He placed it carefully back in his pocket. "Let us return to the parish hall," he said. When they arrived, Mrs. Weatherby was supervising a small committee of concerned parish members who had gathered to discuss the future dignity of the choir. She greeted the inspector with brisk composure. "I hope you are making progress." "Slowly." He walked once more into the vestry. The harmonium stood where it had the previous evening. The evidence cloth still lay near the floor. Purbright crouched beside the carpet. "Sergeant," he said quietly. Love stepped closer. "What is it?" Purbright pointed to the carpet fibres, where the collection box had been overturned. "Notice anything?" Love leaned down. "Coins spilled here, hammer over there?" "Yes." Love shrugged. "That's how we found it." Purbright shook his head gently. "Not quite." He traced a small line on the carpet with his finger. "These marks." Love squinted. "They look like drag marks, yes, but the box fell over." Purbright nodded. "And yet it appears to have been moved first." Love looked puzzled. "You mean someone shifted it before Quince was struck?" "Possibly." Love straightened. "Why would they do that?" Purbright stood slowly. "That," he said thoughtfully, "is a very interesting question." He walked to the vestry door and examined the latch. Then he stepped into the corridor outside. The hallway was narrow, its wooden floor polished by decades of careful use. Purbright bent slightly. "What now?" Love asked. Purbright pointed toward the floorboards. There, near the door, lay something so small it could easily have escaped notice, a tiny fleck of white chalk. Love blinked. "Chalk?" "Yes." "From the hall floor markings?" "No," Purbright said quietly. "This is a different type." Love frowned. "What does that mean?" Purbright straightened and looked back toward the vestry where Bernard Quince had died. "It means," he said gently, "that someone may have been in this corridor before the body was discovered." Love nodded slowly. "And they moved the box, perhaps." "Why?" Purbright glanced toward the choir hall, beyond the door, where rehearsals had been held. "Possibly," he said, "to make the scene appear simpler than it truly was." Love exhaled. "So robbery might not be the point." Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. "In Flaxborough," he said quietly, "the point is rarely the obvious thing." He looked once more at the chalk fleck on the floor. And for the first time since the investigation had begun, Inspector Purbright felt the case beginning to acquire shape, a very careful shape. Inspector Purbright remained in the vestry corridor for several moments after discovering the small fleck of chalk. Sergeant Love watched him with the patience of a man accustomed to his superior noticing things that initially seemed almost absurdly small. "School chalk?" Love suggested. Purbright shook his head mildly. "Too fine. Blackboard chalk tends to crumble differently." Love looked down again. "Choir practice doesn't usually involve chalk." "No," Purbright agreed, "but meetings sometimes do." They stepped back into the main hall. The room had regained its usual quiet order, though there lingered a faint sense that the place had acquired an unwelcome memory. Mrs. Weatherby was speaking to two parish committee members near the piano. When she saw Purbright, she excused herself and approached. "Inspector, I trust you found something useful?" Purbright's expression remained politely neutral. "I am beginning to understand the habits of the building." "Habits?" "Yes. Who uses which rooms, who moves about the corridors." Mrs. Weatherby frowned slightly. "Well, the vestry is usually for the vicar, the choir, and occasionally the church committee. Committee meetings take place here, sometimes, though most are held in the council room across the square." "Has there been a meeting recently?" "Yes, Monday evening, the parish finance subcommittee." Love's eyebrows lifted faintly. "Finance," he murmured. Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "And Mr. Quince attended?" "Oh, yes. He chaired it." Purbright let that settle for a moment. "Who else was present?" Mrs. Weatherby counted on her fingers. "Mr. Pritchard, naturally, Councillor Dobson, Mr. Hemsley, from the bank." And Miss Cartwright took notes. Love scribbled the names down. "Did anything unusual occur during that meeting?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "Well, there was some discussion about choir funds." "Discussion?" Mr. Quince believed certain accounts required clarification. Purbright looked mildly interested. "And did others agree?" "Not entirely." Love glanced up from his notebook. "Arguments?" "Not exactly. More disagreement." Purbright thanked her. As she returned to the committee group, Love leaned closer. "That puts a fair few people around the money." "Yes." "And the chalk?" Purbright gestured toward the corridor. "Committee meetings often use chalkboards." Love nodded slowly. "So someone from that meeting might have come back here last night." "Possibly." They left the parish hall and walked across the square. Flaxborough was enjoying the mild sunlight of late morning. Shopkeepers chatted in doorways. Bicycles leaned against railings. The town's calm exterior remained intact, though its conversation had narrowed to one topic. At the Crown and Mitre, two elderly gentlemen paused mid-discussion as the inspector passed. "Morning, Inspector. Good morning. Caught the robber yet?" Purbright smiled politely. "Not yet." The men nodded with mild disappointment. Love muttered quietly once they had moved on. "They like the robber theory." "Yes, tidier than blaming someone they know." Purbright gave a small nod. They continued toward the bank. Mr. Arthur Hemsley, assistant manager and baritone, received them in a modest office that smelled faintly of paper and polish. "A shocking business," he said gravely. "Indeed," said Purbright. "Mr. Quince was extremely careful with figures." "So I understand." Hemsley adjusted his tie nervously. "If this is about the choir funds, I assure you the accounts are perfectly proper." Purbright spoke gently. "No accusation has been made." Hemsley relaxed slightly. "Mr. Quince did raise certain questions during Monday's meeting. Minor discrepancies." "Discrepancies, only temporary delays in payments. From whom?" Hemsley hesitated. "Well, Mr. Pritchard, for one." Love looked at Purbright briefly. Hemsley continued quickly. "Nothing serious. These matters happen in voluntary societies." Purbright nodded. "And the meeting used the vestry?" "Yes. The council room was locked." "Was a chalkboard used?" Hemsley blinked. "Yes, actually." Miss Cartwright brought one from the schoolroom. Purbright's interest sharpened slightly. "And it remained there afterward?" "I believe so." They thanked him and stepped outside again. Love exhaled slowly. "That puts chalk in the building." "Yes." "And several people arguing about money." Purbright looked across the square where Lionel Pritchard's office window reflected the morning light. "In small towns," he said quietly, "money disagreements often hide something more delicate." Love nodded. "What sort of thing?" Purbright did not immediately answer. Instead, he watched Miss Cartwright walking across the square carrying a stack of music folders. She paused briefly near Pritchard's doorway, exchanged a few quiet words with him, and then continued toward the parish hall. Purbright observed the exchange with mild interest. "Human embarrassment," he said finally. Love frowned. "Embarrassment?" "Yes. Over choir subscriptions." Purbright smiled faintly. "Over reputation." They walked slowly back toward the station. Behind them, Flaxborough continued its gentle routine, shop bells ringing, carts rattling, voices murmuring in doorways. Yet beneath the town's quiet rhythm, the investigation was beginning to widen. More people were now part of the story, more small tensions, more quiet secrets, and somewhere among them, Inspector Purbright suspected, was the person who had moved the collection box, struck Bernard Quince, and then calmly returned to the choir to sing about glory. The widening of the inquiry had the curious effect of making the town simultaneously quieter and more talkative. By early afternoon, Flaxborough had begun to absorb the idea that the death of Bernard Quince might not be the simple matter of itinerant robbery that had first comforted it. People did not say so directly, of course. They merely lowered their voices when the subject arose, which amounted to much the same thing. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love returned to the parish hall shortly after 2 o'clock. The place was empty, save for the faint smell of furniture polish and the soft echo of footsteps on the wooden floor. Love glanced around. "Odd to think it was full of singing last night." Purbright nodded. "Yes. Music lends an air of innocence to almost anything." They walked into the vestry again. The room looked smaller in daylight. The harmonium, the narrow table, and the cupboard of hymn books seemed arranged with the modest efficiency typical of parish buildings everywhere. Purbright stood for a moment without speaking. Then he walked to the cupboard. "What are we looking for now, sir?" Love asked. "Nothing in particular," Purbright opened the cupboard door and examined the contents: stacks of hymnals, a folded banner from last year's harvest festival, and several cardboard boxes containing church leaflets. He closed the door again. Sergeant, when a man is killed suddenly, the immediate surroundings often tell only part of the story. Love nodded. You mean the real trouble might have started earlier? Exactly. They stepped back into the corridor. The chalk fleck Purbright had noticed earlier had been carefully collected into an envelope by the evidence officer. The floorboards were now clean. Love leaned against the wall. Still thinking about that committee meeting? Yes. Arguments about choir money. Purbright smiled faintly. In my experience, arguments about money often disguise something more awkward. They returned to the hall itself. The long rows of chairs had been pushed aside, leaving the central space open. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. Purbright paused. Sergeant? Yes, sir? Something has changed. Love looked around. I don't see anything. Purbright walked slowly toward the front of the room where the music stand still rested. Beside it lay the chalkboard used during Monday's finance meeting. Purbright crouched beside it. What is it? Love asked. Purbright pointed to the board. Someone has erased it. Love frowned. Wouldn't they normally do that? Yes, Purbright said quietly. But not necessarily today. He tilted the board slightly toward the light. Faint white traces remained where numbers had once been written. Columns, figures. Love leaned closer. Looks like sums. Choir accounts, perhaps. Love straightened. Could be someone tidying up. Purbright shook his head gently. If the board had been cleaned yesterday evening, the chalk residue would be evenly wiped. And it isn't? No. He touched the lower edge of the board. See here. Love looked again. One corner still bore a clearly legible figure. 3.10. Love's eyes widened. That's the same amount Quince marked in his ledger. Purbright nodded. Yes. They both stood silently for a moment. Love finally spoke. So someone erased the board after the murder. That would appear likely. Why? Purbright's voice remained calm. To remove something inconvenient. Love scratched his head. But if it was just choir money, then there would be little reason to erase it. Love exhaled slowly. You think Quince had written something more than accounts, possibly a name. Love looked toward the empty hall, and someone came back today to wipe it off. Purbright nodded once. Yes, they walked back toward the corridor door. Love glanced over his shoulder. That means whoever did it knew the board was still here, precisely, and they had access to the hall. Purbright opened the door. In a town like Flaxborough, access is rarely the problem. They stepped outside into the square again. Across the street, Lionel Pritchard was speaking with Miss Cartwright beside the newsagent's window. Their conversation stopped as the inspector emerged. Love murmured quietly. They seem nervous. Purbright observed them briefly. Yes. Miss Cartwright gave a polite nod before continuing on her way toward the church. Pritchard lingered a moment longer before returning to his office. Love watched him go. You still think someone planted that cufflink? Purbright placed his hands in his coat pockets. I think, he said thoughtfully, that Bernard Quince discovered something during that committee meeting. Something worth killing over. Purbright looked once more at the parish hall door. In small communities, he said gently, the smallest financial embarrassment can feel like a public catastrophe. Love nodded slowly. So Quince wrote it on the board, perhaps. And the killer wiped it off. Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. Yes, Lovey sighed. Well, sir, that certainly makes things less tidy. Purbright looked across the quiet square of Flaxborough, where the town continued its steady routines, unaware how close the truth had begun to move beneath its surface. "Yes," he said softly. "Less tidy, but considerably more interesting." Inspector Purbright did not immediately pursue Lionel Pritchard across the square. Instead, he remained standing for a moment outside the parish hall, his hands resting comfortably in the pockets of his coat, while the quiet movements of the town continued around him. Flaxborough, at that hour of the afternoon, possessed the peaceful appearance of a place where nothing especially urgent had ever occurred. A milk cart rattled slowly toward the grocer's shop, a pair of schoolboys argued mildly about a cricket score, and somewhere farther along the lane a door closed with the mild decisiveness of ordinary domestic life. Sergeant Love watched the inspector with the patient curiosity he had developed over several years. "You're thinking about the chalkboard," he said. Purbright nodded slightly. "Yes." "And about Pritchard, among others." Love shifted his weight. "Well, sir, if Quince wrote something inconvenient on that board, the person it concerned would certainly want it erased. That is true." Love glanced toward the solicitor's office again. "And if Pritchard's money was missing," Purbright turned his head slowly. "Money can be missing for many reasons, Sergeant." Love shrugged. "Debts, perhaps." "Perhaps." They began walking toward the police station. Purbright moved slowly, as though allowing the town itself to contribute to his thinking. He had long ago discovered that investigations in places like Flaxborough rarely advanced through dramatic discoveries. Instead, they unfolded through observation of habits, who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, and who appeared too eager to explain matters that had not yet been questioned. As they passed the Crown and Mitre, voices drifted through the open door. "Told you it would be a robbery. Choir money attracts that sort of thing. Terrible business for the church." Purbright smiled faintly. The town still preferred its tidy explanation. Love pushed the station door open and they stepped inside. The small office smelled faintly of tea and paper files. Purbright removed his hat and sat at the desk. For a few moments he said nothing. Love waited. Finally, the inspector spoke. "Sergeant, tell me something. When people conceal financial embarrassment, what usually motivates them?" Love frowned. "Fear of being found out, I suppose." "Yes." "Or pride." "Indeed." Purbright leaned back slightly in his chair. "In communities like this one, reputation is a very delicate possession. It can take years to establish and only a moment to damage." Love nodded thoughtfully. "So if someone owed money to the choir and Quince discovered it, he might have threatened exposure, and that might cause an argument." "Yes." Love rubbed his chin. "Still seems a bit extreme to kill a man over £3.10. Purbright smiled gently. "Money itself is rarely the true cause. It merely reveals something else." "Like what?" "Character." Love absorbed that quietly. After a moment, Purbright opened the ledger they had taken from Quince's house and studied the penciled marks again. Several names carried small annotations. Lionel Pritchard, Arthur Hemsley, Cedric Toller. Even Miss Cartwright's name bore a faint tick mark beside it. Love leaned over the desk. "That's half the choir, yes." Quince was suspicious of all of them, or at least curious. Purbright closed the book, which makes the situation considerably more complicated. Love sighed. Whole choir full of possible suspects. Purbright rose from the desk and walked to the window. Across the square the afternoon light had begun to soften. A bicycle leaned against the church wall. Two elderly women were discussing something with serious enthusiasm near the greengrocer's stall. Life in Flaxborough continued as it always did, yet Purbright sensed the quiet tension beneath the surface. A treasurer dead, accounts questioned, a chalkboard erased, a cufflink conveniently left behind. "Sergeant," he said thoughtfully, "what is the most reliable sign that someone is worried during an investigation?" Love thought for a moment. "They talk too much." "Sometimes. They avoid you?" "Also possible." Love shrugged. "I'm not sure." Purbright turned from the window. "They attempt to guide the investigation." Love blinked. "You mean point us in the wrong direction?" "Precisely." Love considered this carefully. "And you think someone here has been doing that?" Purbright nodded once. "Yes." "Who?" Purbright walked back to the desk and placed the silver treble clef cufflink beside the ledger. "That," he said quietly, "is what we are about to discover." Love leaned forward. "How?" Purbright's eyes rested on the cufflink. "By asking a question." "What question?" Purbright allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile. "The sort of question that appears harmless but which only one person in Flaxborough will find truly alarming." Love straightened slightly. "You mean a trap?" "Not exactly." Purbright picked up his hat again. More of a conversation. He walked toward the door. Love followed him. "Where are we going, sir?" Purbright stepped out into the square once more, his gaze settling calmly on the parish hall. "Back to the choir," he said. Inspector Purbright crossed the square with the unhurried air of a man who had nowhere in particular to be. Sergeant Love followed beside him, aware from experience that this appearance of casualness usually signified the opposite. The parish hall door stood slightly ajar. Inside, voices drifted faintly through the corridor. "They've all come back," Love murmured. "Yes," Purbright said mildly. The choir committee had gathered again at Mrs. Weatherby's request. The members had arranged themselves around the long table, in the main hall, with the uneasy formality of people who felt both responsible and curious about recent events. Mrs. Weatherby rose when the inspector entered. "Inspector, we were just discussing whether rehearsals should be suspended." "A reasonable question," Purbright replied. Several of the choristers looked relieved to see him, though relief in Flaxborough often arrived mixed with apprehension. Lionel Pritchard sat near the end of the table, one hand resting on a stack of sheet music. Cedric Toller occupied a chair beside the window, while Arthur Hemsley sat slightly apart, his fingers interlaced with visible care. Miss Cartwright, holding a notebook on her lap, watched the inspector attentively. Purbright did not sit immediately. Instead, he stood near the music stand and regarded the group with quiet courtesy. "I'm grateful you were willing to meet again," he said. "There are a few small matters that require clarification." Mrs. Weatherby nodded. "Of course." Purbright placed his hat on the stand beside him. "During yesterday's inquiries, we discussed the parish finance meeting that took place here on Monday evening." A brief silence settled over the room. "Yes," Mrs. Weatherby said. Mr. Quince chaired it. Purbright turned slightly toward the chalkboard leaning against the wall. Several figures were written on this board during that meeting. Hemsley shifted in his chair. That would be correct. Purbright nodded. One of those figures was £3.10. The number seemed to linger in the air. Miss Cartwright lowered her gaze toward her notebook. Purbright continued gently. "Mr. Quince appears to have had some concerns about that amount." Cedric Toller cleared his throat. "Well, Bernard was always careful about choir funds." "Indeed." Purbright picked up the chalkboard and angled it toward the light, revealing the faint traces of erased writing. "Unfortunately," he said, "someone appears to have erased part of the board earlier today." Mrs. Weatherby looked surprised. "Erased it?" "Yes." Hemsley's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps the cleaner," he suggested. "Possibly," Purbright said. He set the board down again, but the interesting point is that the figure of £3.10 remains faintly visible. Pritchard adjusted his cuffs. "I fail to see how that relates to the tragedy." Purbright turned toward him. "It may not relate directly." "Then why mention it?" Purbright slipped a hand into his coat pocket and withdrew the silver cufflink. The small treble clef glinted in the afternoon light. "I found this in the vestry." The room became noticeably quieter. Pritchard's gaze moved toward the object. "An unfortunate loss for someone," he said calmly. "Yes," Purbright replied. "A choir member, perhaps?" Tola leaned forward slightly. "Looks musical enough." Purbright held it lightly between his fingers. "I have been informed that it belongs to Mr. Pritchard." The solicitor remained composed. "I own a pair similar to that." "Similar?" "Yes. I received them after the Christmas concert." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "Of course." He allowed a small pause before continuing. "The curious point is that only one cufflink was found." Pritchard's voice remained steady. "I imagine the other was lost earlier." "Perhaps." Purbright looked around the table. "However, the placement of the cufflink in the vestry suggests it may have been dropped during an argument." No one spoke. Purbright's voice remained calm. Mr. Quince had recently been examining the choir accounts. He may have confronted someone about the missing £3.10. Hemsley shifted again. "That hardly proves anything." "No," Purbright agreed. "It merely raises a question." Miss Cartwright finally looked up. "What question?" Purbright placed the cufflink carefully on the table. "The question of why someone would wish to erase a chalkboard and leave a cufflink behind." His eyes moved slowly across the faces around the table. Most of them appeared uneasy. One of them appeared distinctly alarmed. Sergeant Love noticed it too. Purbright allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer. Then he spoke again in the same gentle tone. "There is one small detail I should like clarified. The members of the choir waited." Purbright's gaze rested calmly on Lionel Pritchard. "Mr. Pritchard," he said quietly, "would you mind showing us your cuffs?" For a moment the room remained perfectly still. Lionel Pritchard did not immediately respond to Inspector Purbright's request. He sat with his hands resting lightly upon the table, his expression composed, though perhaps a shade more thoughtful than before. Sergeant Love, standing near the door, observed the subtle shift in the solicitor's posture. It was not fear exactly, more the momentary calculation of a man deciding which of several possible responses might prove least inconvenient. At length Pritchard gave a small, courteous smile. "Certainly, Inspector." He lifted his hands and adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. The right cuff displayed a silver cufflink engraved with a treble clef. The left cuff bore a plain temporary stud. Miss Cartwright drew in a quiet breath. Cedric Tola leaned forward with unmistakable interest. Arthur Hemsley stared at the table. Pritchard spoke lightly. "I'm afraid the pair is incomplete. I noticed the loss this morning." Purbright nodded mildly. "Yes." The inspector picked up the treble clef cufflink from the table and turned it thoughtfully between his fingers. "It appears the missing one spent the night in the vestry." Pritchard folded his hands again. "That seems to be the case." The solicitor's calmness might almost have been convincing if not for the faint tightening around his eyes. Purbright allowed a short silence. Then he spoke in the same unhurried tone. "You left the hall briefly during rehearsal, yes, to retrieve a pencil from my coat, and you went toward the corridor." "That is correct." "Sergeant," Love shifted slightly, watching. Purbright continued. "Mr. Quince also left the hall shortly before the second hymn." "So I understand." Purbright placed the cufflink back on the table. "It would appear the two of you met in the vestry." Pritchard's gaze remained steady. "That would be speculation." "Possibly." Purbright glanced toward the chalkboard resting near the wall. "During Monday's finance meeting, Mr. Quince raised the matter of £3.10 missing from the choir subscriptions. Hemsley stirred uneasily. Pritchard's voice remained smooth. A trivial amount. Yes, Purbright agreed. But Mr. Quince seems to have taken it seriously. Love cleared his throat quietly. Purbright continued. He also made a note beside your name in the ledger. The room grew heavier with silence. Miss Cartwright looked down at her notebook again. Cedric Toller shifted his chair. Pritchard spoke at last. Inspector, are you suggesting that a minor accounting delay led to murder? Purbright smiled faintly. No. He stepped slowly toward the chalkboard. I am suggesting that Bernard Quince discovered something he believed improper. He tapped the faint chalk figure still visible on the board. £3.10 was the figure he wrote here. Pritchard said nothing. Purbright continued quietly. He may also have written the name of the person responsible. Hemsley glanced up nervously. Yet when Sergeant Love and I examined the board this afternoon, that name had been erased. Pritchard's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table. Perhaps someone tidied the room? Perhaps. Purbright turned back toward the group. The difficulty with that explanation is timing. Love spoke for the first time. The board was wiped after the murder. Purbright nodded, which suggests that the person whose name appeared there wished it removed before anyone else noticed. Miss Cartwright looked up slowly. The meaning of the inspector's words had begun to settle over the room. Cedric Toller said quietly, You believe the killer came back? Purbright inclined his head. Yes. He paused. And he also attempted to guide the investigation by leaving a convenient clue behind. His hand rested lightly beside the cufflink. Pritchard's composure remained outwardly intact, though the effort was now visible. Inspector, he said carefully, if you are implying something, it would be more courteous to say it plainly. Purbright regarded him calmly. I intend to do exactly that. He glanced briefly at Sergeant Love, who straightened slightly. The inspector's voice remained as gentle as ever. However, before reaching the conclusion, there is one small matter still to clarify. The choir members waited in tense silence. Purbright turned slightly toward the vestry door. It concerns what Bernard Quince discovered during that committee meeting and why it caused someone in this room to panic. He looked back toward Lionel Pritchard. And the explanation was about to begin. Inspector Purbright allowed the silence in the parish hall to settle fully before speaking again. In Flaxborough, silence often proved more revealing than accusation. Lionel Pritchard remained seated with outward composure, though the slight tension in his shoulders had begun to betray the strain of maintaining it. Around the table, the other members of the choir watched with increasing unease. The comfortable familiarity of the room had altered. It had become a place where reputations might shift irreversibly. Purbright rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair. Mr. Quince, he began gently, was a careful man, perhaps excessively careful. When he examined the choir subscriptions, he noticed the missing £3.10 and wrote the figure on the board during Monday's meeting. No one spoke. He also made a note beside one particular name in his ledger. Purbright's gaze moved quietly toward Lionel Pritchard. The difficulty for Mr. Quince was that the discrepancy was not merely a late payment. Pritchard's voice remained steady. You seem very certain of that? Yes. Purbright folded his hands calmly. The amount itself was trivial, but Mr. Quince had discovered that the subscription book had been altered, small figures amended, receipts shifted between entries. Arthur Hemsley inhaled softly. Purbright continued. It was done carefully enough that most people would never notice, but Mr. Quince had spent many years selling screws and hinges. He possessed an eye for small adjustments. Cedric Toller leaned forward slightly. You mean someone was taking money from the choir? Borrowing, Purbright said mildly. At least at first. Pritchard's eyes remained fixed on the inspector. You are building a rather imaginative theory, not entirely imaginative. Purbright lifted the ledger from the table. These pencil marks indicate Mr. Quince had begun checking the figures against earlier entries. By Monday evening he had identified the person responsible. Miss Cartwright looked pale. And he wrote the name on the board? Yes. Purbright gestured lightly toward the chalkboard. During the meeting he wrote the figure £3.10 and the initial of the person who owed it. Pritchard's expression hardened slightly. That proves nothing. No, Purbright agreed. What proves more interesting is what happened during rehearsal. The room remained perfectly still. Mr. Quince left the hall and went into the vestry. Mr. Pritchard, you also stepped into the corridor. Pritchard said nothing. Purbright continued. I believe Mr. Quince confronted you about the accounts. He intended to raise the matter formally with the parish committee. Love shifted slightly near the door. Purbright's voice remained calm. The conversation became heated. You attempted to persuade him that the matter could be settled quietly. And if he refused? Pritchard said. Purbright inclined his head. He did refuse. The solicitor's composure finally began to falter. You have no witness to that. No witness, Purbright agreed. Only the consequences. He glanced toward the vestry. The hammer lay nearby on the harmonium. During the argument you struck Mr. Quince with it. Miss Cartwright covered her mouth. Tola whispered softly. Good Lord, Purbright continued in the same quiet tone. The blow killed him almost instantly. Realizing what you had done, you overturned the collection box to suggest robbery and hurried back into the choir. Love nodded slightly. And the cufflink. Purbright lifted the small silver piece from the table. It fell during the struggle. Pritchard's voice was tight now. And the chalkboard. Later that evening you realized Mr. Quince had written your initial on the board during the meeting. So this morning you returned to the hall and erased it. Silence filled the room. Pritchard's gaze moved slowly around the table. The faces that met his were no longer merely curious, they were deeply unsettled. At length he exhaled quietly. It was meant to be temporary, he said. No one moved. I intended to repay the money before anyone noticed. Purbright nodded. I believe that. Pritchard's voice dropped, but Quince would not allow it. No. For several seconds the solicitor said nothing more. Then he stood slowly. I suppose, he said quietly, that resolves the matter. Sergeant Love stepped forward. Yes, sir. As Love escorted him toward the door, the members of the choir remained seated in stunned silence. After they had gone, Mrs. Weatherby spoke faintly, all this over such a small amount. Purbright replaced the cufflink in his pocket. In small communities, he said gently, the size of the sum matters less than the size of the embarrassment. The choir members slowly gathered their things and left the hall in subdued groups. By evening, Flaxborough would begin its careful process of discussing the matter with regretful fascination. Inspector Purbright stepped outside into the fading light of the square. The town had already resumed its ordinary rhythm, bicycles passing, shop doors closing, distant voices carrying across the street. Sergeant Love joined him. Strange case, Love said. Purbright looked back once toward the parish hall. Yes, he adjusted his hat slightly. Though choir practice, he added thoughtfully, may never feel quite the same again. They walked slowly toward the station as the evening settled quietly over Flaxborough.